Finally, my fellow Americans, let me say this. Of those to whom much is given, much is asked. I cannot say, and no man could say, that no more will be asked of us. Yet I believe that now, no less than when the decade began, this generation of Americans is willing to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Since those words were spoken by John F. Kennedy, the people of America have kept that compact with mankind's noblest cause, and we shall continue to keep it. Yet I believe that we must always be mindful of this one thing. Whatever the trials and the tests ahead, the ultimate strength of our country and our cause will lie not in powerful weapons or infinite resources or boundless wealth, but will lie in the unity of our people. This I believe very deeply. Throughout my entire public career, I have followed the personal philosophy that I am a free man and American, a public servant, and a member of my party. In that order, always and only. For 37 years in the service of our nation, first as a congressman, as a senator, and as vice president, and now as your president, I have put the unity of the people first. I have put it ahead of any divisive partisanship. And in these times, as in times before, it is true that a house divided against itself by the spirit of faction, of party, of region, of religion, of race, is a house that cannot stand. There is division in the American house now. There is divisiveness among us all tonight. And holding the trust that is mine as president of all the people, I cannot disregard the peril to the progress of the American people and the hope and the prospects of peace for all peoples. So I would ask all Americans, whatever their personal interests are concerned, to guard against divisiveness and all of its ugly consequences. 52 months and 10 days ago, in a moment of tragedy and trauma, the duties of this office fell upon me. I asked then for your help and God's, that we might continue America on its course, binding up our wounds, healing our history, moving forward in new unity to clear the American agenda and to keep the American commitment for all of our people. United, we have kept that commitment. And united, we have enlarged that commitment. And through all time to come, I think America will be a stronger nation, a more just society, a land of greater opportunity and fulfillment because of what we have all done together in these years of unparalleled achievement. Our reward will come in the life of freedom and peace and hope that our children will enjoy through ages ahead. What we won when all of our people united just must not now be lost in suspicion and distrust and selfishness and politics among any of our people. And believing this as I do, I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
You have just heard the President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in an address from his office at the White House. President Johnson spoke for almost 40 minutes to the exact second. The advance text of his address did not contain those last remarks saying, and I quote from President Johnson, "I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for the presidency." That was not in the advance text of the speech. Advance copies of President Johnson's speech were put out about an hour and a half before he spoke. It was known before his speech that he intended to call, as he did, for a limited bombing pause over North Vietnam. The speech is so important that perhaps the first thing we should do is review the major points of it, taking them just about in the order the President took them. First, he called for a reduction of air and sea bombardment of North Vietnam. 90% of the country, about that, will be affected. Only those areas directly adjacent to the so-called demilitarized border zone will continue to be bombed. The President emphasized this is only the first step in a unilateral de-escalation of the war by the United States. He asked Ho Chi Minh to reply in kind. Now, White House sources indicate that what the President hopes for, just as an example, is a communist ease-up around Hue, less shelling of the Khe Sanh, the garrison of the Marines there, less activity in general around the DMZ. Those are examples of the kind of response in kind the President is hoping to get immediately from Ho Chi Minh. Point number 2, mentioned by the President, calling on Great Britain and Russia as co-chairmen of the Geneva Conventions to follow up the United States' unilateral de-escalation by getting peace talks started. And President Johnson mentioned that Averell Harriman and Llewellyn Thompson, 2 former ambassadors to Russia, both popular with the Russians, are named as the President's representatives available to go any place, any time to talk a peace. Point number 3, the President announced that he's sending an additional 13,500 Americans to Vietnam over the next 5 months. Some of these will come from reserve units. The President did not specify from what units the men would come. Additional Vietnam spending. The President said that $2.5 billion additional Vietnam spending will be necessary for this fiscal year, $2.6 billion for the next fiscal year. Now, current Vietnam spending is running at the level of about $26 billion a year. What the President proposes for the current fiscal year is raising that to about $28.5 billion for Vietnam spending. He laid heavy emphasis on what he considers to be the fact that a tax increase is necessary to support this additional Vietnam spending and to curtail inflation. The President also emphasized rather heavily increased South Vietnamese participation in the war. 135,000 additional troops being put forward by the South Vietnamese government, trained and soon to go into combat. The President pointed out that much of the additional spending will be necessary to arm and equip these additional South Vietnamese forces. Then, at the very end of the speech, after quoting former President John F. Kennedy, President Johnson said, and came as a distinct surprise to all, "I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for the presidency." My colleague Roger Mudd has been in the CBS studios here in Washington with me. Roger, no question about it, this was a bombshell politically.
Well, you really don't know where to begin. As you said, there was no warning. The announcement that he would not seek another term or accept another term was not in the text. There had been some rumor knocking about the city for perhaps a month when the political fires began to heat up, but the rumor, the report, the possibility that President Johnson would not seek another term seemed so remote that it was dismissed as wishful thinking on the part of his critics.
Well, Roger, I would say it wasn't wishful thinking or otherwise. I must say that I was one of those who did not believe that the president would in any form or manner pull out of this campaign.
Well, it seems really so unlike him to give way in the face of adversity. Those who thought he might pull out considered that he wanted to retire without a defeat under his belt, and this was taking into account his drive to win and go down in history as someone who would not suffer the ignominy of being beaten at the polls, especially at the election, especially by someone like Robert Kennedy or Gene McCarthy. This is obviously the ultimate sacrifice on the part of President Johnson.
Roger, I wonder if we might now replay through videotape that section of President Johnson's speech, that stunning moment when he said that he would not run. Here, by videotape replay, is the President's announcement.
Will come in the life of freedom and peace and hope that our children will enjoy through ages ahead. What we won when all of our people united just must not now be lost in suspicion and distrust and selfishness and politics among any of our people. And believing this as I do, I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
One of those memorable moments, historic moments in American political history. As you were saying, Roger, just before we replayed that videotape, it has, what it says is that President Johnson is willing to pay the ultimate price, to make the ultimate sacrifice for peace in Southeast Asia.
Well, you know, just watching that videotape replay, your heart begins to palpitate again to sit there and watch this performance, because it was so unexpected, so really unlike him. And as we were saying before we saw him again, it is the ultimate political, personal sacrifice. The immediate question that's raised is, with President Johnson now a lame duck president, what effect his offer to suspend the bombing and reactivate Harriman and Thompson in the Geneva context, what effect that will have on Hanoi? Would the North Vietnamese government now prefer to wait and see who the new nominee of the Democratic Party, Republican Party, and what the polls are, or what the election results are, before they begin to deal with the American government? This is an immediate problem that might well affect the efficacy of the president's offer. The other question that immediately comes up is what happens to domestic politics. The president now will not go into any primary campaigns. He is out of it altogether. This leaves the Democratic nomination up to Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. It leaves the Republican nomination up for Richard Nixon. The president is no longer a factor. It's what I'd rather do, Dan, is go home and come back tomorrow morning and begin to talk about it.
Well, I think we all would rather. It is a stunning moment, and for those of you in the audience who may be saying, well, those two fellows are having a hard time coming up with something to say, that's the truth of the matter, because it did come as a distinct surprise. But, Roger, I would take issue with a couple of things that you said, just for the sake of discussing it. It seems to me that this turns the whole political basket upside down. For example, it has been assumed over these past few weeks that Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York was out of it as far as the Republican nomination is concerned. It seems to me that this might very well reopen as a live working possibility and at least an overt effort by the New York governor to get the Republican nomination. The other factor is, does this not as a practical matter, or does it have the effect of turning the Democratic Party nomination race? It's obviously a two-horse race, but it seems to me it catapults Senator Robert Kennedy now into the lead horse position. Not to say that he will necessarily get the nomination, win the nomination, but as a practical matter, considering his name, his organization, and his finances immediately available, doesn't this springboard him into the lead position for the nomination?
Well, I don't know about that, Dan. What occurs to me is that the Democratic Party now has two candidates going for the nomination, and both of them are peace candidates, which changes the whole nature of the Democratic Party and what kind of campaign it will wage in November. Without President Johnson, it is true that without a President Johnson to campaign against, it is true that the opposition to McCarthy is reduced considerably, and he's really got nobody to go against except Robert Kennedy. And I think the assumption has been for quite a while that in a contest between the two, and without the presence of President Johnson, Senator Kennedy would undoubtedly be superior. I'm not sure that President Johnson's withdrawal in any way elevates the chances for Governor Rockefeller. If you take that as an assumption, and that Richard Nixon will get the Republican nomination, then you have the Republican Party, the War Party, and the Democratic Party, the Peace Party, which again makes me want to go home and come back again in the morning to talk about it. A couple things occur to me, aside from the political thing, which is so fascinating. Number one is there is, unmentioned this evening, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president.
That thought occurred to me when you were saying it's now a two-horse race, and I agreed. One tends to forget former Senator Humphrey, Vice President Humphrey, because he has been so much in Lyndon Johnson's shadow. But it seems to me it is, in fact, a three-horse race when you think about it, and Humphrey has to be considered.
Well, the difficulty is that President Johnson will, as a lame duck president, he will not have the control over the Democratic Convention that he did in 1964. There will be some influence, but you remember in 1952, Harry Truman's last year in the presidency, he was a lame duck.
By the way, Harry Truman, I think, said within the past 24 hours that President Johnson would run and win.
Well, but that was before the speech. But you remember Harry Truman in 1952, lame duck, and he was not for Adlai Stevenson. And you saw what happened. His control was not of any great consequence at all in '52. So whether President Johnson can transfer the allegiance of the Democratic Party regulars to Hubert Humphrey or not is quite another question. I don't think that's automatic at all. I'm sorry that out of a confused brain we neglected to mention the Vice President. Obviously, he would be moving forward and onward and upward quite quickly with this new situation.
Well, it raises a lot of possibilities. For example, if McCarthy and Kennedy should get deadlocked at the convention, Vice President Humphrey would certainly stand a chance, and a lot of things can happen. One thing we all tend to forget is it's still a long time between now and the convention time. In terms of politics, we have almost half a year left, and half a year in politics is forever.
Well, let me ask you this. Is Vice President Humphrey now eligible, freed of the restraints of being number two? Is he now eligible, able to go into primaries? Could he go in and start moving in his own?
A lot of things
right?
could happen. For example, President Johnson could resign just before the conventions and make Hubert Humphrey, in fact, President of the United States. There are people in this year, topsy-turvy as it has been, one hesitates to say anything is impossible. That, of course, is possible.
But
certainly, he is free, I think.
Filing deadlines have not passed to such an extent that Humphrey himself could not go into California and could not pick up a few of the late spring, early summer primaries.
Yes, but the readings out of California are that Senator Kennedy is very likely to run well ahead of any other Democratic candidate in the California primary. Those have been the readings. One thing that, in the talk about politics, fascinating that it is, considering what President Johnson has said, and for those of you who may have joined us late, President Johnson said that he was not a candidate for re-election and would not accept his party's nomination. Prior to his saying that, the big headline out of his speech had been the announcement of the bombing reduction over North Vietnam. What do you think the reaction in Congress is going to be? Obviously, the reaction is going to be in terms of a flood on the political side about the president not seeking renomination. But about this increased spending, the $2.5 billion in increased Vietnam spending for this year, any problem getting that through?
Well, what he said specifically was that he was now willing to accept expenditure control on the tax cut, which is really a direct quote from Wilbur Mills. And he said he would be willing to take expenditure control as the Congress may seem fit to pass when and if the Congress does it, which means that he will get his tax cut, he says, if the Congress asks for an expenditure reduction, he's willing to go along with that.
Is he now more likely to get his tax increase?
Well, that's another question. The Congress is waiting for the President to act. The President is waiting for the Congress to act, and both want the other over the barrel. No one wants to go first declaring this dam and that canal and that dredging project shall be cut. They want the other fellow to move. So it's a matter of sweating out. But I think, just in answer to your question, the prospects are now immeasurably improved that the President would get this combined 10% tax increase, and I think it's $4 to $6 billion tax cut.
I think we have our first reaction from one of the candidates. Senator McCarthy's reaction, I think, has just been handed to you there.
Well, this is from Waukesha, Wisconsin, where Senator McCarthy is campaigning tonight, and he says, quote, "This is a surprise to me," which is no surprise to say. It changes the political picture for America in 1958, which is not a surprise either.
1968.
1968. At a Carroll College speech in Wisconsin, the crowd jumped to its feet, apparently upon the news of the president's withdrawal, applauding, and the chant began, "We want Gene, we want Gene." So everybody's surprised, including the president's main opponents. One little thing that occurs to me when you mention the bombing pause is unexplained in the speech is why a bombing pause now would produce negotiation when it didn't a couple of years ago, and number two, why the Viet Cong would be unwilling to take advantage of the bombing pause now when it took advantage of it the last time we had it.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the president, and certainly it's near unanimous with all of his advisors, believes that the enemy will take advantage of the bombing pause, does not believe that it will lead to negotiations. But what has happened here, that the hue and cry both in this country and especially abroad from our allies as well as from our potential opponents abroad has been so strong for a bombing pause that the President has decided to go with one. We're out of time for this cataclysmic evening. Dan Rather with Roger Mudd, I'd like to leave you with the thought of Disraeli, that Victorian English politician who once said of candidates and campaigns, what we least anticipate seldom occurs, what we don't expect usually happens. Dan Rather, CBS News, Washington. Good night.
This has been a special report from CBS News in Washington.